All right, so let's talk about Gen X, aka everybody's favorite forgotten generation, and what you might need to know about them in 2022. As usual, this event is good for 1.0 CFRE credits. This is professional certification. If you're pursuing it, we like to keep these both worthy of credit and free because some people's professional development has gotten cut. And so just make sure to make a note at the end of the chat, or excuse me, at the end of the webinar in the survey, and that way we can keep a record for you. Today's agenda is this. I won't read all of it. The most important thing to know is that the recording and the slides will be sent around later today. And so this is pretty cool. That way, if you have coworkers or anyone else that needs to see this and didn't get a chance to, or if you don't feel like taking notes today, just know that that's coming. Okay, quick introductions. My name is Patrick. I've met a lot of you. I'm lucky to be the co-founder and co-CEO of an organization called FreeWill, alongside my wonderful co-founder, Jenny, pictured here. And then, as I mentioned, we are part of a wonderful team that hit 200 people last week. And we got together for the first time since March of 2020. So that was really exciting. We went to this beautiful place in upstate New York in Port Jervis, for those of you that know the area. And it was wonderful. It went way better than I would have thought, given how sort of new this mass gathering stuff is. And really, really nice. So it was delightful. I know some of the FreeWill folks are listening today, and just, so it was so wonderful to spend time with you. Okay, and then last thing before I get into the meat of everything, we always love to say thank you to you all for joining, and often by giving away some of our favorite books. And so this book by an amazing author named Priya Parker is called The Art of Gathering. And it basically talks about what to do when you get together with a bunch of people, whether it's a family gathering or a social gathering or a meeting. And so some really interesting, really interesting stuff here. We are able to give it away to, I believe, 20 folks. And so just make a note in the survey if you're interested, and we'll sort of draw some folks out and send it to you. Don't forget to put your address, otherwise we can't send it to you. It's pretty obvious, but people forget to do it all the time. Also, some people are going to put their address in the chat right now. Don't do that. We will send you, there'll be a survey at the end of this, and we will, and that's where you need to do it. Okay, so how's your week going? We asked you this week. Couple of things to note, some really positive signs. Look at this blue line of how happy people are feeling. It's way back up, almost at our peak. So that's exciting. What does that tell us? Well, spring is here for the folks up north. Summer is here for everybody else. People are generally feeling pretty good about things. I think while the war in Ukraine rages on, it's not sort of front of mind for a lot of folks. Even though there's some tough economic news this week, generally people are feeling really good. We also looked at how confident people are about hitting their goals, and we're a little bit up from last week, but still down a bit from that peak in early, sort of really beginning of the year. And so we'll keep an eye on this. One of the factors we won't talk about much today, but maybe we'll cover in a future session is, hey, it looks like we could be heading into a recession. Now, typically, giving tends to be relatively recession-proof, which is really good news. You look at giving in 2008, only down very slightly, despite sort of a massive catastrophic financial crash. But we'll probably talk at some future session about how to navigate things like that. But for now, we're going to talk about Gen X donors. And so let's dive in together. When we asked you how you would describe Gen X donors, here's what you said. Number one, busy, right? These are folks who are frequently have children and are working, very few are retired, savvy, generous, tech, loyal, wealthy, but also things like untapped or opportunity. Some people said tired, which is probably a truth. Some of those people might be Gen X. Let's see if we can get back here. Educated, a whole bunch of other things. Forgotten is another big word. Every time we sort of talk about millennials or baby boomers, there's a bunch of folks on this call, on this communication, that always say, what about Gen X? Because maybe if you are a member of the Gen X community, Gen X generation, feel free to note that in the chat. We'd love to hear about you all. So there we go. Jessica and Lexi and Wendy and Ashley. You can often sort of tell sometimes by some of the names. We don't have much of that here. But who is Gen X? Well, they're born between 1965 and 1980. Right? So these are folks between baby boomers and millennials, they are 42 to 57 years old right now. There are 65 million of these folks, about 8 million fewer than millennials and 5 million fewer than baby boomers. So they're a relatively smaller generation, which is why we do talk about them a little bit less sometimes. They're expected to outnumber baby boomers by 2028. Why is that? Because baby boomers are beginning to pass away in what's called the Great Wealth Transfer, which we'll talk about in a second. But that's how many folks there are. So exciting things. Why are they smaller, right? Why are there more millennials and more boomers than Gen X folks? And so a lot of it has to do with birth rates in the United States. Obviously, immigration plays a role across the board, but let's first focus on American births here. So a couple of things that happened. You go down, let's look in the 1930s and 1940s. Remember these folks, let's just go back to years for a second. So these are folks born between 1965 and 1980. So hold that in mind, 65 to 1980. What does that mean? Let's say their average parents are 25. Those parents are about 1940 into about 1965. Well, as we can look at, right, so 1940 and maybe a little bit older, because some people are having, multiple births, look at that Great Depression dip. Now, those are the parents, some of those are the parents of Gen X. Another way to think about this is the people that were not born in 1947 were not having children in 1937, were not having children in 1967. And so there's actually fewer of the sort of natural parent generation there in the Great Depression. And then you see this sort of, it's not only that Gen X is smaller, it's that boomers are enormous, starting in 1946, peaking in 1959, 60. Those folks are mostly too young to have given birth to Gen X, right? Which is why millennials are coming back up. It is also the case that you see fewer births generally during a recession, which is why there were fewer of their parents born in the Great Depression. And then the 1970s, stagflation issues, energy crisis, things that are going to feel a little bit familiar to folks going into the next few years. You had a significant drop for economic reasons in births there. We may actually begin to see, if we hit recession, you might see a drop in birth rates going through 2023 to say 2026, which will be interesting to watch as well. Now, what else happens? Well, they were also born when fertility rates began to decrease. More women are entering the workforce, which has a negative implication on birth rates. Not a judgment, just a decrease, right? Also 1970s, this is their sort of historical entrance, thought of as the cult of the adult versus the 50s cult of the child. They're also commonly called the latchkey generation. These are folks who lack supervision between the end of school and parents coming home for work. This is also correlated with widespread two-parent households. The more educated their parents, the more likely to be latchkey. So, and yet nearly 30% of them have a bachelor's degree or higher. So even with less sort of household supervision, they're significantly more educated than their parents in preceding generations. Remember, only 15% of silent generation folks went to college, 25% of boomers, 39% of millennials. Now there's a couple of different factors here. Why are more of them going to college? Well, when you go back to the silent generation, college-going young adults were almost entirely male, and so you knocked off 50% of the population right there. Generally less wealthy, their parents were considerably less educated. We don't talk much about what's called the greatest generation before them, et cetera. The last generation, this is a little sad to note, where higher ed was broadly financially rewarding, right? So they were at a sort of interesting intersection where higher ed was much more affordable than it was for millennials, and the upside was still considerably there. They were the first generation where more women than men had degrees. And so this is really interesting. They were part of a trend in declining marriage and parenthood rates. So this has a big impact on giving, which we'll get to later. About half of Gen X is married. I mean, this is really striking, right? These are folks on the youngest end are in their 40s, and almost half of them have never been married. More than millennials, right? Fewer than half of millennials, and less than baby boomers. So maybe some folks will be married in their 40s and 50s and 60s, their 70s and beyond, which is, great news, but also people are fine to stay unmarried. And yet this is a really big shift, right? It's normal to be unmarried in this generation, deeply in contrast to say silent generation, where about 80% of folks were 62% of Gen X women have had a child, which is more than millennials, less than boomers. And so you do see a lot of folks having children without being married, which is a shift from especially the silent generation. Gen X was also the first generation to commonly have divorced parents. So we talked about that latchkey setup. Part of that was that you had more two-parent households where both parents were working, and part of it was that you had more one-parent households where one parent was working. And so really, really interesting. What else is happening? This is, startups are commonly associated with millennials. This is largely incorrect. So they're the most entrepreneurial generation. They drove the dot-com boom. There was a lot of failure there. There was also a ton of learning. They own the most small businesses. 46% of all small businesses are owned by Gen X, which many of you would not have expected. 55% of startup founders are Gen X. Again, this is not intuitive, and so it's really worth wrapping our heads around it. Folks like Elon Musk, Jack Dorsey of Twitter, Larry Page and Sergey from Google, these are all Gen Xers, right? And so it's easy to sort of imagine the startup founders as this like 23-year-old hard driving folks. The failure rate among startup founders who are 20 to 30 is dramatically higher than, say, the failure rate of startup founders who are 40 to 50. So really, really interesting. Okay, what else? So they're politically conscious, and they became socially conscious during the Reagan era, which is fundamentally different than millennials, who sort of came of age during the Obama years for the most part. They grew up amid the 80s recession. Federal debt tripled. Increased focus on defense programs and cut to defensive aid, right? Because there's sort of full-blown war with Russia to times to an existential threat. Obviously, crack epidemic, AIDS epidemic during some of their formative years. We saw an increase in crime. They saw the so-called war on drugs, an explosion in prison population, which deeply affected different pockets of the United States. They tend to be more skeptical of government involvement compared to millennials. And they're more conservative than boomers on economic issues. In fact, there's an article in Politico a couple days ago, which basically talks about how Gen X became the Trumpiest generation. And you have folks that tend to be a little bit more socially liberal than their parents, but in some ways more economically liberal and more skeptical of government than boomers were. So there's some interesting stuff there. Let's talk about the typical life of a Gen X American. So you were born in 1973 as fertility rates were declining at the peak of the oil crisis. So you would have been born into a family potentially with many fewer siblings than your parents had, which is interesting. At age 2, you don't really remember this, the Vietnam War ends. So you're age 8, you're sort of first reading any news or seeing any news on TV when Reagan assumes office. At 9, unemployment hits a high of 11%, which is pretty striking. At age 11, the first Apple Macintosh comes out, right? So you would have this might be in your school or your library. Really basic computing shows up at the dawn of when you might be able to understand it. Also, age 11, Run DMC becomes the first platinum-selling hip-hop group. And hip-hop is really one of the great artistic achievements of this generation. Age 16, the Berlin Wall falls. It marks the unofficial end of the Cold War. So you grew up in the Cold War, but it wasn't really the defining part of your teenage years or your later years as you really looked at the world. You're 1991, so you're only 18 when the first Gulf War begins. It's only 42 days. Age 18, CDs overtake cassettes. You would have gone through all of high school making mixtapes for your friends or your crushes, and then suddenly CDs begin to overtake it. You're probably doing the Columbia House or I think it's BMI, these sort of like 12 CDs for $1 scams that were widespread at the time. Age 20, AOL gains popularity, the internet goes mainstream. So the internet is mainstream for the large part before you're entering the workforce to a meaningful degree, right? So this is from a professional standpoint, these folks are very digital native, not childhood digital native the way that millennials are, but really they are tech first. And we'll talk more about the effect that has on giving and different types of giving. Age 21, Nirvana lead singer Kurt Cobain, who personified the 10-year grunge music trend, dies of suicide. Grunge might be the other sort of large-scale musical gift of the generation, along with hip-hop. You're 27 when the dot-com bubble bursts. You're 28 when 9/11 happens. Cell phones are now ubiquitous. This is the beginning of the war in Afghanistan, one of the first big NATO engagements. Now, this is really interesting. We'll come back to sort of stocks and investments later. For the market to crash at age 27 is one of the best things that can happen to you. Because what happened is this is really when folks are sort of paying off student loans and getting to save, and they're saving at the bottom of the market. And so there's a lot of wealth that's created here. It's a really interesting dynamic. So folks, obviously there's a bunch of stuff happening in the market right now. Folks who are 25, 26 right now, there may have some unemployment challenges, but if you can start investing in your 401k, it's a really positive sign for you. At 34, the first iPhone is released and smartphones quickly become ubiquitous. Also at age 34, the housing crisis and the start of the Great Recession. And so this is important. 35, so it's been 35 years of your life before the first Black president was elected. Obviously Barack Obama. Age 37, Blockbuster goes bankrupt. And so you basically have the, in the 90s, you had the descendancy of cassettes, the ascendancy of CDs. And then a decade and a half later, you had the ascendancy of streaming and basically the decrease in video rentals, right? Which used to be such a ritual for older millennials and Gen Xers to sort of go to the store and figure out, what are we watching, and really hoping that, the new Jurassic Park or whatever is still in there, even though the video store has 45 copies. By the way, there is a Twitter account that is The Last Blockbuster, and if you haven't checked it out, it is absolutely wonderful and hilarious. Age 42, Supreme Court rules in favor of gay marriage. So if you had grown up as a gay adult, you would have basically lived a huge portion of your life with that being illegal in most states. Age 47, COVID happens. First female VP is elected. A lot of historical societal shifts happening there. And you are squarely in your peak earning years right now, right? So you basically spend your whole life going to the office, doing all these things. And then you might have half your professional career remaining and this all shifting. All right, so let's talk about Gen X giving, which is really interesting. So 55% of Gen X in America donates to charity. Despite being a smaller generation, they're giving more than 23% of all charitable dollars, right? So they are punching above their weight from numbers. Boomers give 41%, millennials give 14%. Gen X is in ascendancy to sort of take over the throne as the primary givers, probably in about 8 to 10 years. They're very charitable. 24% of their time believe volunteering has the greatest impact. Coca says, my life has been summed up in a few slides, so you're welcome. You're welcome, Coca. They're more likely than others to use things like Google search to find information on charities. They're very tech savvy. They're very thoughtful there. A whole bunch give online through a charity's website, but 14% give mail, 9% give via social media. A lot of folks connect with charities through e-newsletters. This is one of the most common things they do online. Otherwise, they buy products. They read online magazines or online news quite commonly. So that's what we're looking at here. A couple other things to note here. They're the only group, setting aside Gen Z, which doesn't count as a major giving force right now, that doesn't prioritize worship as one of their top giving areas. So they're decidedly less religious than their parents and baby boomers who may be sort of 10, 15 years older. So this is a really big shift that is just confronting a lot of religious organizations right now. Gen X tends to give less. So that's interesting. When we asked you all, what percentage of your donor base is between 40 and 55? I mean, look at that. Half of you said between a quarter and half. So wildly important. Very few said 76 to 100%, which makes sense. But 18% said, hey, it's 51 to 75%. And this is a really big group here. And about 30% said less than a quarter. So really meaningful component here generally there. Lauren asks, will the slides be shared after? Yes, they will. So we'll share all this data. Also, we talked about what percentage of fundraising dollars come from these folks. And so 43% of you said 25 to 50%, right? So really big swings here. 13% said 51 to 3/4. So really meaningful. All of this is going up, right? So as the years goes on, with the exception of plan giving, which is obviously massively important with great wealth transfer, Gen X is going to be ascendant, boomers are going to be descendant, millennials are going to be ascendant. It'll be a decade before Gen Z makes a meaningful contribution here. Okay, so Gen X, this is what I just said, but let's go through a little bit more data. Gen X is making huge leaps in wealth, I mean, just enormous. So they're really hitting their strides. Just as a reminder, there's only a couple ways to become wealthy enough to become a major donor, right? So when we think about major gifts, they typically come from major donors. Major donors typically have a bunch of money or resources or assets. Here's how it happens. You can earn it through compensation, right? That's one way to become very wealthy. You can own it through investments, property, stocks, crypto, et cetera. And you can inherit wealth, right? These are sort of the three, you know, you can win the lottery, you can get a huge lawsuit, but these are sort of the common paths to big time wealth. Gen X is in their peak years for all three right now, right? So why is Gen X wealth growing so quickly? All of these things that are happening are all going in their direction in a pretty hard way. Gen X experienced the biggest wealth of any generation since the pandemic. Their average net worth soared by 50%, and their total wealth increased by $13 trillion, just above boomers at 12.8, right? So the last 5 years were better for Gen X than anybody else. They now own 29% of US wealth. Remember, this is pretty impressive for a relatively small generation. Since 2010, the median net worth, right? So we're talking about widespread prosperity here of Gen X households has risen 130%. So really, really important stuff here. And it's going big. You can look at this wealth share by generation. Again, we'll share this slide, so we'll go through some of this relatively quickly. Look at, you know, my millennials, including me, up at the top. Hey, we're starting to make a dent in that yellow. That's growing pretty quickly. Gen Z doesn't even get a color on this. Gen X, look at how big that pink or coral or whatever you want to call it is growing. Silent generation now nearing almost 10% of wealth, right? So silent generation is major donors fading out relatively quickly. That purple cohort of boomers still going strong, right? So boomers still obviously own a ton of wealth, but look at how ascendant Gen X is, and just year over year growing considerably. Why is that? You know, many boomers have ended their earning years. They've retired, their assets continue to grow, but Gen X is really going in a bunch of directions. They're in their peak earning years. They were obviously hit super hard by the 2007 recession, but have fully recovered their wealth. They moved into the later stages of their careers, and so now they're your senior managers, they're CEOs, they're leaders. They make up 25% of the population, 31% of the US income, right? This is the adult population, not just the general population. Average Gen X householder is $113,000 a year, more than any other household right now, right? Any other generation. So these are your peak earners, which is really important. Remember, okay, so they're making more, they're in their peak earning years, and for folks in either gay or heterosexual couples, it is common that both of these people are earning money, which is different than, say, the silent generation or the early boomers, where you're more likely to have just one person making money. So really big shift there. Home values have increased rapidly, right? Pandemic and low interest rates made a huge housing boom that's padded Gen X pockets. More than 2/3 of Gen X are homeowners. Over the past year, they've seen a 10% increase in their home equity. So this is going really big. They own 30% of US household net wealth compared to only 17% in 2019. So we're almost doubling in about 5 years. Just tons of wealth happening here. These folks, a lot of them were in their house buying years, and say that, remember that 2008, right? So they're about 30 in that time for many of them. And that means they're buying again at the low point of the market, right? So good for those folks. That has grown considerably. Despite recent market downturns, these investments have appreciated over the last couple of years. The market is still above what it was in the pandemic, and obviously it's above where it was pre-pandemic, even with a little bit of a downturn. 38% of Gen X own stock. They hold 26% of the total stock market, only second to boomers, right? So there's a lot of wealth here in equities, only second to boomers. We'll talk more about that. Some of that boomer stock will shift to Gen X as great wealth transfer happens. At least 1 in 4, they're also investing in crypto, which is surprising to folks, right? Some of you forget this and think it's only millennials and Gen Z. Let's go back here. So look at have investments, Gen X, millennials. Now this is interesting. Millennials are actually some of the highest because they're doing both stocks and crypto. They're some of the most invested assets. But stocks, 38%. They actually more Gen X folks own stock than percentage of boomers. Crypto, Gen X, what a high percentage of Gen X compared to Gen Z owns crypto? Easy to forget here. Mutual funds, Gen X sort of got the lesson that index funds are actually some of the smartest things to do. ETFs, index funds, et cetera. NFTs, right? So, 13% of Gen X owns NFTs, which you might be surprised to learn. REITs, I actually forget what REITs stand for, but it's a real estate investment fund. If anyone wants to tell me what REITs stand for, you can help out the whole group. Things like commodities and options and other stuff like that. So Simone says real estate investment trust, I believe. Great job. Thanks. It's always nice to have almost 1,000 smart folks on the call helping out whenever we don't know something. So you can see they're pretty broadly based, invested to an even greater degree than boomers, right? So there's a bunch of boomers with a lot of wealth. Gen X asset ownership tends to be more widespread. Crypto market has rapidly grown. Even with recent drops, Bitcoin's now worth about $30,000, triple what it was worth pre-pandemic. Gen X is heavily invested in crypto, owning 28%. Second only Millennials. One of the things that people don't talk about is, yes, more Millennials own crypto than Gen X. Gen X, on average, tends to own more, right, per person that owns it. Why is that? They had a lot more money in 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016 than Millennials did to invest in crypto, and so that's grown to a considerable degree. So it's easy to miss. They're also obviously set to inherit a lot of the great wealth transfer. So $73 trillion is going to be passed on from wealthy older generations over the next 2 decades or 2.5. Gen X is expected to reap about 42% of this, so $31 trillion over the next 2 decades. They will inherit more than any other generation, moving them into becoming the dominant givers. Really, really, really important. This is what it looks like in structure here. About $70 trillion getting passed on generally. Some of that's going to other baby boomers. A lot of it's going to Gen X. A lot of it's going to Millennials. Why? We know that sort of Millennials tend to be the children of boomers. So why is more of this going over Gen X? Well, the oldest boomers also tend to have some Gen X children. And so the folks that are most likely to pass away at the beginning of this and sort of more likely to pass away generally over this 20-year span are the older boomers. And so many of them have younger Gen X children, which is why that's the case. All right, so what does this mean for fundraising? What do we actually do with all this information? We know that Gen X is a small but mighty generation, that they have more income than anybody else, that they're rapidly ascendant from wealth, that they're going to be taking on a ton more wealth as the great wealth transfer happens, that they've really won the lottery in terms of how the housing market played out for them. What does this mean for fundraising? Well, let's remember this is still a generation in transition, right? So they are in the midst of big things. They're getting older, they're paying off debt, they're acquiring wealth. Over the next 10 years, some of them will be entering retirement, right? Many will have only given modestly. Many of them are new to philanthropy, but their capacity is growing extremely quickly. And these will soon be your most affluent donors. They are also wealthy, but they are not retired, which is different. Your wealthiest boomers, to a big degree, are retired, and that's a whole different ballgame. They are ready to move from annual to major givers. They are some of your most important folks over the next 10 years, right? Rising share of wealth. They'll be making more donations, more regular donations, and larger donations. When we look at some of the path over time, right, you can look at Gen X growing considerably, 23%, and on the rise of total giving, higher than matures, so bigger than silent generation. That's what this chart calls matures. Closing in on boomers over the next, say, 10 years, and then Millennials are obviously on the rise as well. This is interesting, right? So they care more about tax-friendly gifts than previous generations, right? 42% see gifts as a tax-deductible status as a big motivator, nearly twice as much as any other generation. Why is this? We don't have total proof, but let me give you a quick hypothesis. Millennials, for the most part, don't have enough money to have paid a ton in taxes yet, so they don't think about taxes as much. Gen X has been earning more for a long time, therefore has more knowledge around tax savings. It is also the case that they were coming of age in the Reagan years, making them a little bit more anti-tax than potentially some of the preceding or subsequent generations. And they tend to be more educated than boomers or the silent generation, right? So the idea that they're really being, they're sort of like financially literate to a high degree, and not just men, which might have been the case in sort of decades previous. You have a lot more awareness around tax deductibility and tax savings and things like that compared to boomers and other folks. So 42%, more than twice as much any other generation. And so what it means is some of this tax savvy giving is moving to the forefront in a way it hasn't been. Really, really interesting. Only 10% of Americans right now take itemized deductions on their taxes. This is a big shift from a few years ago. And so if fundraisers connect Gen X with tax-friendly ways to give, they're going to make a much bigger impact. So really important for all these folks. As an example, getting folks to give stock or crypto, or even homes, instead of cash will save them on capital gains taxes while getting that same federal deduction. So really important stuff here. They're also really thinking about impactful ways to give. So besides asset gifts, planned giving will be important over the coming decades here. Many Gen X donors are never married and without children. This is the #1, not married, no children, #1 indicator of being a good planned giving donor. Way more than sort of previous donations, way more than overall wealth. Not married, no children. So what that means is that planned giving is becoming more and more important as every year goes on, because when you look at any age group, they tend to be less married than their predecessors, often with fewer children than their predecessors as well. They're starting to make estate plans now. The average age of a will maker is actually 54, which puts you at the brink of baby boomers and the oldest Gen X, which is interesting. And so there's more stuff there. Let's talk about what success looks like for Gen X donors in 2022. First thing is, remember, these folks are on the rise and we want to be welcoming them into philanthropy. So for giving circles, et cetera, think about how you can get some of these folks who might be giving small amounts at first, but will rise quickly, right? You can have something like a rising leader circle, which might be useful for both Gen X and Millennials, right? Get people on that train to be able to give a lot more. You want to provide them with few options for thresholds like named scholarships. It's also true of Millennials, but given that almost half of these folks are never married, some of your scholarships always tend to be a husband and a wife, right? If you look at older colleges. And so how do you actually help people name scholarships with their friends or in smaller groups? Really important. And making sure that stewardship for these things include opportunities to make career connections or get involved, and not just these sort of middle of the day luncheons, which you cannot go to if you have a job. So really important stuff here. Second thing, remember that these folks are giving a lot more, but they are all still working, right? They're hitting their peak earning years. Many of your donors will work for companies that match charitable gifts. If you know your donors' employers, ask them to submit a match. You can also look up whether employers match on, I think, Charity Navigator, which can be quite helpful. So why is this useful? You're getting your biggest gifts matched. People are constantly forgetting one thing, right? So this is what's going to happen. I make a donation of $40. Part of the receipt says, wow, that's great. Think about a matching donation. I make a stock gift of $40,000. People aren't mentioning the match, right? Make a crypto gift of $10,000. Nobody's mentioning the match there. I make a DAF gift of $10,000. Nobody's mentioning the match there, right? So if we're only getting our $50 gifts matched, it's almost negligible. We should be making sure that all these $10,000 gifts are getting matched. Now, many employers have a cap on it. It might be $5,000, it might be $1,000, but it can be quite meaningful there as well. So really, it's basically free money that most people are forgetting about. So make sure you're on that. Ask them for non-cash gifts. Just some basic language. Thank you so much for your gift. You may already know this, but many folks don't realize their employers will match contributions. Does your employer do matching gifts? So every type of gift you need to do this, right? Not just tiny cash gifts. Tip number 3, make sure you're not turning stock gifts away. Gen X really wants tax-friendly ways to give more than anybody else. Giving via stock or crypto rather than cash will be more helpful to them because they'll avoid capital gains. They're likely to pass on these savings to you. And we know that people give a lot more from their wealth than they give from their income. So really valuable. Get ready for some really large gifts. Research shows, as you know, we talked about this a lot, organizations that take and focus on non-cash gifts grow 6 times faster than other folks. when we ask you whether or not people actually know how to do this, we get a lot of different answers, right? So what do you think your non-cash giving on a scale of 1 to 5 is? I mean, look at this, right? So stock giving on average 2.6. Maybe we know a little bit of it. Crypto giving 2.3. We actually see data that a ton of crypto owners don't know they can donate. This is a huge loss for your organization. There's a really big role to play in education. So in your email outreach, in your direct mail, which we'll talk about in a second, make sure that folks know they can donate stock or crypto on top of giving cash. This is super important. All right, here's an example. We love our friends at Amnesty International. Just a simple email they sent out. As you sit down to do your taxes this year, I want to share 2 ways you can save on taxes to financially support our critical human rights work at less cost. Big number 1, donate stock, right? Most Amnesty International supporters who donate stock save on 2 types of taxes at the same time. This is the stuff that is music to the ears of the Gen X community, right? Oh, love saving on taxes, love having impact. And so this type of language is really, really valuable. Don't turn away crypto, right? For crypto, you can set up your own wallet, you can do a bunch of things. Many nonprofits prefer to have experts do it. There's some super easy ways to set up crypto. We launched a tool called Crypto for Charity. We love it. People tend to really appreciate it. Accepts a ton of currencies. Average gift is about $7,000, right? We're seeing a lot of Gen X giving here. It's all auto liquidated to US dollars. I'm actually going to do a whole walkthrough of this on Thursday if anyone wants to hang out. But I also want to talk about crypto for one other thing, because I realized that many charities don't understand one of the fundamental properties of crypto, which might make it the best thing to happen to fundraising in an exceedingly long time. All right, so there's this really important part of crypto that will be life-changing for a lot of charities, and nobody ever talks about it, which is a huge problem. Just as a reminder, some of you know a lot about crypto, some of you know very little. But crypto lives on what's called the blockchain, right? So the blockchain is a public ledger of transactions, the same way your bank has a private ledger of transactions. This wallet transferred this much Bitcoin, therefore this wallet now has X amount, this wallet now has Y amount, okay? Well, stick with me here if you don't know this. What it means is that when you get a donation from a certain wallet, you can look on the public blockchain to understand how much crypto is in that wallet, right? Think about this as the equivalent of every time someone writes you a check, it is public information how much money is in the bank account that they just sent to you, right? And this is not some like secret sleuthing, in privacy invasive thing. Everyone has opted into this public blockchain. And so if a $3,500 donation comes from a wallet with $10 million, you can steward this donor for much larger gifts, right? Emily just made that sort of head explosion emoji, right? This is so interesting because suddenly you have these Gen Z donors who we know own more crypto than millennial donors who are donating crypto, and yet you don't know how much that is. And so we are working on a bunch of tools that will sort of help unearth this level of giving. And if you are someone who is trying to facilitate Gen Z major donors, the idea that you might know how much crypto someone owns when they give their first $100 of crypto could be life-changing. And so just keep this in mind, right? This is what everybody had hoped would happen with any other asset, and super, super important. Daphne says, what about the crypto crash that just happened? Crypto tends to go up and down all the time, right? So this tends to be cyclical the way most markets are. And so, yeah. Okay. Other things to note, right? Everyone remembers the video killed the radio star thing. If not, ask your parents. Gen X killed direct mail. And so when you look at this teal line, right? This sort of blue, green, whatever that crayon was called, starts with a C. I don't remember what it's called in the Crayola box. And the Muggles have this great song called Video Killed the Radio Star. Cyan, gosh, what a smart group. Okay, so look at the cyan line. Look at what, male, the first thing that's striking when we go all the way to the right, right? So silent generation, 43% of these folks prefer to give by mail, 38% prefer to give online, right? So even the folks who are 75, 80 plus are almost reaching parity. This graphic's a couple years old, right? So you'd imagine the mail line going down, the online going up for everything. At this point, we assume that silent generation, meaning folks who are older than baby boomers, prefer to give online compared to direct mail. Boomers also, again, this is going to be shifting, right? So as we look at the next few years, direct mail going down, online going up. Gen X, I mean, just murder direct mail, right? You go down by a factor of 2. They look very much like millennials and even Gen Z in this group, right? And so these people are using the internet at 20. They use it their entire professional lives. Some of them are environmentally conscious. They have really good radar for junk, right? So they're the people blocking junk phone calls and junk email and junk mail, even if it. Now, is this bad news for organizations? Maybe, right? You get fewer gifts from direct mail, but the good news is sort of that email is way cheaper. And so having a really good landing page and spending $5,000 or $10,000 or $20,000 on landing and having infinity mail for basically free, meaning email, compared to spending $10,000, $20,000, $50,000 on a mailing is really useful. I'm also, by the way, floored sometimes people ask about the environmental impact of crypto. I'm like, I know that your nonprofit is sending 100,000 pieces of direct mail a year. That's a lot of trees. And so from an environmental standpoint, I think there's a real shift in Gen X against direct mail towards things like software email. So anyway, just another input there. What it really allows us to do is shift online. As we do that, we need to do things like fixing our donate page, knowing that donate pages have gone from the world of getting all the $10 donations to really moving into major giving territory as well. A third of Gen X put off by outdated websites, plus over half are willing to add on a couple of dollars to cover processing costs, which is interesting. Your donate page is the only way that many of these folks are interact with your website. So the donate page is getting just like 100 or 1,000 times more traffic than your ways to give page, which means your donate page really has to be up to speed. You want to be doing things like suggesting stock or crypto or donor advised fund giving on your donate page and not just your ways to give page. Here's an example. Oops, let's skip this. Basically, if you're taking information, if you're taking some of these gifts, make sure that you're capturing information. We'll send this note along with the slides. But the United Way does this super well, right? This is their cash giving page. They have a bunch of really important options. Southern Poverty Law Center also does this really well. On their cash giving page, they have options to give bigger gifts. This is so important because you don't want to get a $50 gift from someone that should be giving you $5,000. Really, really important. Okay, I think I'm getting a junk phone call now, so you'll hear that in the background. Make sure the website isn't built for retirees, right? This group is growing their wealth, but they're not retired. Much of giving is going to happen on nights and on weekends, which means that simply having contact information for major gifts doesn't work anymore. And this is really important. Sometimes you'll say, you want to give stock, call this number, right? Call Sarah at whatever the number is. But if Sarah doesn't work nights and weekends, which hopefully she doesn't, you've lost all this major gifts. And so you need easy ways for people to give at the times that are convenient for them to do so, not just the times that are convenient for you to do so, which is important. Gen X is making their estate plans now, and those between 45 and 65 account for 42% of all bequest dollars committed to charity. Why is this important? If you capture these bequests, you'll also capture more real-time dollars. Research shows that people who make a planned gift actually dramatically increase their giving, right? So Gen X is squarely in the category of people who are making estate plans, right? They might have a couple of kids, they might have some serious wealth, they have a house. It's not out of the question that someone who is 53 could pass away from something, right? So these plans are going into place and you want to be in them, right? Partly because it's going to be a bunch of money in 25 years, and partly because it's going to increase the real-time giving. It also lets you know who your diehard supporters are. So if someone who is 55 says, listen, it's going to be a while, but I left you $300,000 gifts in your will, you think, wow, this person, A, has a bunch of money and really, really cares about us. Let's invite them on that pre-opening tour of the museum and start talking about other types of giving. So really, really, really important. You need to be providing easy ways for donors to leave a bequest. Obviously, There's online tools like FreeWill, but also you can do a will making kit or other things like that. You can even give folks a list of local lawyers who do estate planning, right? You want to be helping out with that process so we can start to engage these folks on it. Then remember, all these people are giving online. Don't just include planned giving as like a quarter-page ad in your monthly magazine that nobody's reading, right? So make sure it's included in email outreach, e-newsletters, etc. Plan giving and will making info should go to all your supporters, right? Everyone who's thinking about an estate plan is not just your 80-year-olds, and anyone can make a planned gift because it doesn't affect them financially in the moment, right? There are a couple times when this will be really useful, and Gen X is very likely to engage. January, New Year's resolution stuff around will making, August for Make a Will Month, and then October, which is National Estate Planning Awareness Week. Having reasons for people to give means people are just giving a ton. Okay, so that is all we're going to tell you about Gen X. It's a lot. There's 15 minutes of it. I hope it was really useful. We're going to share a couple of resources to make things easier for you. First, this book we love, The Art of Gathering, Priya Parker. My colleague Simone is going to drop this, thank you Simone, in the chat right now. So Simone just did that. Click that link. If you don't mind, the survey is incredibly useful to us for a range of reasons, but also it's how we're going to get CFRE credit and enter to win this book. We've also put together a crypto fundraising guide, which is very, very useful. So if you want that, just make a note in the survey as well, please. And then if you're interested, and obviously no pressure at all, we do have a bunch of best-in-class tools that our team has made. So the #1 estate planning tool in America generates $6 million in bequests a day. If you're interested, just make a note in the survey. Is that as well as some best-in-class stock giving tools that make stock giving much easier, and some crypto tools that we talked about a little bit. So on Thursday, in 2 days minus 1 hour, I will be doing a 30-minute demo of the crypto giving sites for your organization. And so feel free to join that if you like. And then my colleague, Alyssa, a week later, will be doing a whole group demo on planned and major giving tools if you're interested as well. She's great. And then we also can walk you through some of these tools in a one-on-one context if that's easier for you. So we have a lot of lovely, amazing people. And for those of you who are FreeWill partners, those folks can attest that this group is just wonderful to work with. And so we'd love to chat with you as well. All right, so we're going to take a 30-second break. So that's 60 seconds, but we're running low on time, so we'll be even quicker. I am going to look through some of the key questions that you all asked. If you don't mind, also please use this time to fill out the survey, and we'll be back in about 36 seconds. Great. Okay. So a bunch of really good questions. Cindy says, can you speak to the disparity between having more wealth in other generations, but also more expenses currently and in the near future? As an example, college expenses for children. So certainly folks that are strapped for expenses, particularly college, it's getting more and more expensive. Those may not be your peak donors. Just a friendly reminder that about 40% of Gen X folks don't have children at all, and so it's easy to miss. Also remember that only about 40% of millennials are going to college, or 40% are getting bachelor's degrees, so a higher percentage are going to college. So let's just make sure we're not overreading that situation for a generation. But you will see big disparities among Gen X, even among wealthy Gen X, about their ability to give right now. And so focusing on folks without children is almost always a great strategy from a giving standpoint. At what age do you recommend starting planned giving marketing or outreach? Paula asks this. Paula, this is one of the areas where email being close to free is a tremendous advantage because you can go more expansively without spending a ton of money the way you might on direct mail. We would recommend going as broad as possible for the same reason we talked about with Gen X, right? So one, everybody on the planet needs an estate plan, and younger folks are actually less likely to have one. So there's a bunch of reasons there. And two, it will help identify your most diehard supporters. And also it's the case that for those of you that have things like legacy societies, it's quite useful for folks to be able to join those at a younger person because they start to see what these philanthropic circles look like. And by the way, your older donors in that love having younger donors around. So really, really smart. What is the best way for nonprofits to determine the age, marital status, employer of their donors? Some of this will be in effective surveys. So you can ask things like, do you talk about, you can't just, it's harder to be like, are you married, right? But for things like parental status, you might say, do you frequently talk about philanthropy with your children? And the answers might be, yes, all the time, sometimes, rarely, NA, don't have kids, right? And that's a totally reasonable question to ask and will also give you a sense of who doesn't have children. Does anyone in the audience know about whether crypto wallets include beneficiary designations? This is from Samuel. Samuel, crypto is treated as property by both the IRS and most state law. So beneficiary designations happen in wills themselves, right? Different than a retirement account. So wills themselves or revocable living trusts in some states, particularly California. And the same way that you might leave a stamp collection in a will. So this is really valuable here. So plan giving will be useful. There's a bunch of instructions that need to accompany that. So people have things like passwords for crypto wallets. But from a legal standpoint, the big thing here is around a will. Kristen asks, is there such a thing as carbon neutral crypto? My understanding is that it's energy intensive and not sustainable. Kristen, there are three things to know here. The first thing to know is different cryptocurrencies have vastly different energy usage. Particularly things like Bitcoin tend to be more usage, and then others can be as much as 1,000 times less energy because of different ways the computational power works. There are also some things that are carbon neutral, like a coin called Solana, which is rising in popularity. So that's actually carbon neutral. It doesn't mean it's perfectly energy free. It does mean that as a community, Solana invests in a bunch of carbon offsets to neutralize it. And so it's actually less carbon intense than, say, the traditional American financial system, which does use a lot of energy. Ryan asks, how do you access public blockchain and check on wallet amount? Ryan, it could be a bit complicated, actually building out some tools that will do this. So if you want to join the Thursday demo, do that as well. Michael asks, what about the tax implications from accepting crypto? Is it taxed as an asset? Yes. So for you, no tax implications if you're a 501c3, right? You take it and sell it. For the donor, you avoid all those capital gains and you get a full income tax deduction. So that's why people love it, right? It's a double savings you get from stocks as well. I realize that we are close to time, so we're going to pause here, even though there's a lot of great questions. So thank you all for those who submitted it. We will have another session in 2 weeks. I think it's 2 weeks, yeah, 2 weeks on June 7th, which is actually understanding in what is likely to be a particularly cacophonous election year, how do you navigate fundraising when suddenly all the noise is reaching a fever pitch, right? So many of you are in states with big time governor's races, with big time Senate races, some House seats that are going to be incredibly competitive. And obviously, we can only assume that it's going to be a pretty intense election from both sides. And so what does that mean for philanthropy? How do you navigate that? We have done a bunch of research. We will also do a bunch more research in the next 2 weeks, but feel free to join that as well. And then as always, if you have any ideas or questions or anything, just email me at patrick@freewill.com. So with that, we just want to say a really big thank you. First, before we thank you, thank you to my colleague Simone, who did a ton of hard work and research to make this possible. So give Simone a virtual fist bump if you can. And then everybody else, I think it's so great that you're here and pushing yourself to advance your career, in your learning and your organization. And it really means the world for you to give us an hour of your time. So thank you so much. Someone asks how they can register for the June 7th one. It's just in the survey as well, so make a note there. But love having you here. I personally learned a ton in the research we did for Gen X, and so hopefully you enjoyed it as well. But hope to see you in a few weeks. Thanks for all the toy suggestions. Thanks for all your attention, and looking forward to seeing you in 2 weeks.